The background to this was, I think, a decision taken towards the end of 2010 and 2011. It was a decision taken between Scottish Government and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, and it was part of the settlement for local government for 2011 onwards. And in that context, there was an agreement reached that in return for a guarantee of teacher jobs, that £60 million would be sought from teachers' conditions of service. And that was brought to the SNCT, and part of that, as you know, was a freeze. And you'll also know the internal discussions and indeed some of the difficult decisions that were taken inside the teachers' unions before, in return for the protection of jobs, a final package worth £45 million was secured of cuts, and quite draconian cuts from teachers' conditions of service. And I'm not going to rehearse that. These were difficult decisions for the unions concerned and attracted a fair degree of criticism to the unions, but also, I think, protected jobs at a critical time in budget delivery. And from that, the SNCT set those out in a very broad package called SNCT 1124. It just simply said there would be a freeze in the chartered teacher programme, and that was supplemented by guidance from the SNCT Joint Secretaries called JS 1124, and that said that from that point there would be no progression in the chartered teacher programme other for those who were who had previously embarked in a module before the 6th of June 2011, or who were in a phase of learning at the 6th of June 2011. Now, part of the discussion between Scottish Government and COSLA was that Mike Russell undertook to conduct a review of teachers' terms and conditions. The so-called McCormick Review was set up, and when McCormick was published, then McCormick said that the chartered teacher programme should be brought to an end. And as we know, that relied heavily in anecdote and very little in real evidence or working evidence. But I think the context of McCormick is nothing to do with the contribution the chartered teachers were making. It was nothing to do with the value of the chartered teacher programme to education systems. It was all to do with the value of money, or the value of the pound. And I think why it was latched onto was it was quite simply a means of capping something that local authorities felt was an uncapped source of people getting pay rises by another means. And the decision of the Cabinet Secretary to accept Recommendation 8, as David said, was about a year ago, carefully orchestrated to be after your conference, but not before your conference. And that decision was handed to the SNCT to give some effect to it. Now, the discussions inside the SNCT on this part alone were quite problematic, because the local authorities were working from a view that having secured an end to lifetime conservation for those who held promoted posts which had disappeared or where the value of the promoted post had declined, part of the package was that they would have a period of 3-year cash conservation. And they were very clear that their ambition for chartered teachers was exactly the same. And it was a difficult process by which we secured full pay protection for people in the chartered teacher programme. But the price, I think, for that was basically the continuation and the ending of progression through the chartered teacher programme. Some people had registered with the GTCS to start the chartered teacher programme, but did not enter the course of study, and under 1235, they were precluded from entering the programme. Those who were in a phase of learning allowed by the Joint Secretary's letter in 1124 were allowed to continue that phase of learning, to get to the end point of that phase of learning. And additionally, some provision was made that anyone who was precluded from continuing the module or that phase of learning outlined the year earlier would be allowed to complete that part of the programme if there was an extenuating circumstance that cut across their learning. And I know this has been quite contentious, and it was hard decisions that were taken in terms of people who applied there. This simply applied from the period from the 6th of June 2011 through, that there were people who had the most distressing circumstances that took place in 2010, 2009, 2008, it slowed up the progression in the scheme. But they were out with the terms of the circular. And I can't say much more than that, and I would find it difficult to answer precise questions on that, because there are still some appeals within the system, and they've moved beyond the joint secretaries. Those who are in that area where they're completing a module or a phase of learning that is allowed have got until the 30th of June this year to complete that phase of learning. Now, there are people who are completing the charter teacher program, or they've got accreditation of prior learning, who are allowed to complete that. The joint secretaries or the SNCT cannot interfere with people's right to continue study, but what it does is if you are out with the circumstances described in SNCT circulars, then you complete that for your own benefit, but for no monetary value in terms of where the SNCT sits. The final point I'll make is that the recommendations that came to McCormick came to the SNCT, and there were about 20 recommendations that landed on the doorstep of the SNCT from the Cabinet Secretary. He agreed with the teachers' unions that some of these would not be taken forward, or they were acceptable. But the SNCT has since gone through a process to try to deal with these recommendations. The major areas of work are working groups on the duties of teachers, and the view of McCormick that the duties of teachers should be removed from the SNCT handbook and described by reference to the standards set by the GTCS, and the view of McCormick that in terms of teachers' working hours, there should be an open flexibility in terms of how teachers' hours are defined. That process is at an end within the SNCT, and we're now part of a process where each organisation, each union on the teacher's side will be going through an internal machinery to try to determine where they are in relation to those recommendations or the conclusion of those discussions. From the EIS perspective, the EIS has committed that we will ballot our membership on the McCormick package. At the final meeting we had at the SNCT to dispose of that, COSLA reminded us that they believed that the decisions already taken in chartered teachers should be viewed as part of that package. Now, we don't accept that. We think we've reached an agreement on chartered teachers. That's the end of the story. But the employers may have a different attitude. I think I started this by saying that we arrived in very hard decisions because of a tight economic context. That economic context is not going to recede. Those of you who work locally at local authority level will know that next year is looking worse than this year, and the year after is equally tight. It's unfortunate that two of the parties to the SNCT saw chartered teachers as a means of solving part of their cash problem and then brought that to the SNCT. But I'm not going to apologise for difficult decisions that were taken by EIS people within the SNCT, because it was a hard situation we were in, facing a choice between a jobs context and the context of trying to protect conditions of service. The final point I'll make is that what happens in the process? Well, the PRD process in 1235 is exactly the same process that was agreed in the role and enhanced contribution of chartered teachers. And I've spoken here before on the role and enhanced contribution of chartered teachers. The PRD process is the means by which you talk to your managers about how you contribute to the work of the school. The only addition, I think, that has been said by the SNCT to that process is that what people contribute should be commensurate to the point in the chartered teacher pay spine that people sit on. It would be illogical if someone who was parked forever and a day at scale point 1 was asked to make the same level of contribution as someone who's a fully fledged, fully chartered teacher. It must be commensurate, it must be equal to where they were in the programme. It's unfortunate that the chartered teacher programme has been abandoned by Scottish Government. In the years after the Macron Agreement, Scottish Minister upon Scottish Minister talked about the jewels in the crown that came from the 21st Century Agreement. And two of those was the protection of the induction scheme for people to complete probation, and the other was the Chartered Teacher Programme, which allowed a means of people tapping into their skills, developing their skills, in return for a salary reward. And that has now been lost. And it intrigues me in terms of the description of a master's level profession for Scotland. And you can share the aspiration of Donaldson in that or not. But when every teacher in Scotland reaches master's level, then the unions are going to ask the paymasters how they reward people who have a master's level qualification. It's the part of the equation that's been lost out in some of the developments to date. So I'll finish there, David, and I'm happy to take questions from the floor.
Thanks, Drew.
Hi, Drew. In view of the enhanced contribution from chartered teachers, is there any idea of how much would be required to fulfil that? I understand the PRD process will be by negotiation with your line manager, but is there a ballpark figure of hours that would be acceptable for that enhanced contribution?
The SNCT has always resisted the idea of tying hours to the contribution. We've resisted it, I think, for two principal reasons. The first one is it almost locks in the concept that's a bit like giving management time. And we've said that this should be part of the discussion with an individual. And I think that would reflect the diverse nature of the contribution that people make. Some chartered teachers, I think, have given an ongoing commitment to do a piece of work in the school. And that's a recurring, ongoing piece of work. Others might do a bit of targeted work, like supporting a teacher who's struggling. And so it's impossible to set those rules at the centre. That's got to be part of the dialogue that takes place at local level. I'm not picking up a great deal of issue on the field about that. Now, there may be, and I think people will be entitled to come back to the SNCT because it must be by agreement. Nobody can be imposed on to say, you will do this because I have determined that's the contribution you should make. It should be about a dialogue, and if somebody's not been able to establish that dialogue, they're entitled to go to the next level at council level, and then they come to the SNCT. The circular was drafted upon exactly the same principles as was set out, well, to recognise the GDCS standard for chartered teachers, but also to build on the enhanced contribution of chartered teachers that the SNCT agreed just a few years ago that some people seem to have forgotten about. But those principles were carried forward in the current circular and should underpin the discussions at the establishment level. And if there is a problem, then that can be picked up and supported.
As far as I remember from looking at the enhanced contribution description, there were 3 aspects to it. I don't have it imprinted on my memory,
okay.
But I think there was possibly an A, B, and a C, and it included professional inquiry, certain things that a chartered teacher should be doing, certain actions. What wasn't clear is whether there's an expectation that all those things should be happening at once all the time. And it did say that they should be doable within a 35-hour week. Yeah. And it looked to me that it couldn't all be done at the same time.
Absolutely, I agree totally. The professional actions were leading and or contributing to projects, and after being an earlier session about the diffuse nature of leadership in schools, maybe the terminology could have been a bit tighter. Supporting, advising, mentoring colleagues, developing aspects of the curriculum and leading curricular change and assessment in the school, and leading in service on research work or educational development, and developing relationships in the school and beyond in the wider community. Now, if you did all of those, you'd have no time to teach. Chartered teachers are principally teachers. So I think it's using those, building on the study you undertook, because people would have had different aspects of focus in the study that led them to being chartered teachers, and then to negotiate how you use that in a school setting. And also remember that it's not just simply designed to be picking up a contribution to the school. There are some people who are well placed, particularly in smaller schools, to work beyond their particular establishment. Now, that does require a bit of time and a bit of management structure, but people can contribute to the local authority as well as the individual school. And there are some very, very good examples of chartered teachers being used across schools to lead curriculum for excellence. And that's the type of practice that I think should be encouraged.
Any more questions? Drew, I'll just ask, I was interested, we were in the same session this afternoon with Dee Torrance, looking at the kind of problematic nature of distributed leadership. But you're saying that you aren't coming across stories at the moment of people having a difficult time engaging with their employers and management. I'm just, the findings from Dee with her doctoral work, although you can't generalise it across Scotland, it was a small-scale study, seemed to suggest that there were certain problems being faced within teaching teams that might be recognisable for many of us as chartered teachers.
Well, let me turn it around a wee bit, David. I think there are issues in a number of schools over PRD process. And I think before we begin to embark on where the GTC are about professional updates and PRD, we need to sort that across a number of schools, because it's not a top-down model, it's a dialogue. And I'm not encountering anything more specific for chartered teachers than I might encounter for teachers across the board. If the PRD process is an open process in a school, then a chartered teacher is no more difficulty than anybody else. If a PRD process is open to managerial direction, too heavy managerial direction, then chartered teachers are probably a bit more exposed than some other teachers because they'll look for an extra pound of flesh. But I haven't detected a significant issue. But I am clear in my mind that if the GTC moved to professional update and setting out a process by which teachers have an entitlement recognised to develop their skills is going to work and is not going to be abused, then the PRD process has got to be an effective dialogue between individuals and between professionals. If it's not, then professional update will fall into disrepute.
Just picking up on that, Drew, that actually we work within a local authority where the head of education has come out and categorically said that chartered teachers have no impact on teaching and learning, and that is filtering down through line managers. And I have a line manager who has stated categorically that he does not value chartered teacher, and that creates an ethos where the PRD process can become enforced, and you've got to be very brave to stand out against it. And I fear for the future. I was fortunate my PRD process got binned because the local authority, through the injunction of the EIS, working underground, so to speak, are now no chartered teacher will be given additional duties or requirements until we've decided locally, at local authority level, what we will do. But when that comes, I fear because of the attitude that there is.
I'll make 2 points, Lynn, in response to that. I think the first one is that managers who have such a blinkered approach to what's going on should come to something like this, first of all. Absolutely. But I think, well, Saturday or not, everybody here is here not just simply to describe what they're doing, but to find out from other people what they're doing. And if we've learned anything, education should be an open process. And if there's any commitment to lifelong learning, as Donaldson set out, with any meaning, then people should be adapting to good ideas that are coming there. And I think in previous conferences here, I think I've detected perhaps an undercurrent of certain managers that they're a bit afraid of people becoming too empowered. And that's part of the issue. I think the second point I detect is that, and this is linked to budgets, at times of contraction, people revert to managerial types. And it's almost setting out a budget context that cuts across some of the language of Donaldson. It was benign. I mean, Donaldson sat in McCormick, and if you read the tone of his own report and the tone of the McCormick report, whether it was intended or not, the McCormick report appeared like a managerial document, setting out a management context and a top-down model. And I think the SNCT are trying to make some sense of that type of inherent contradiction. Of whether we can do it, I'm not quite sure. But it's not just a matter for the SNCT, it's a matter for professionals across the board, because people are entitled to have their voice say. Otherwise, we're just enforcing a stereotype of school structures that should have been binned 20 years ago and deserves to be binned. And if it's been resurrected in the back of tight budgets, then the people who are managing schools need to take a step back and consider that what they lose by putting teachers back in a box significantly outweighs what they gain from teachers having a voice in the running of schools.
We've still got time for a couple more questions. Drew touched on a number of wider SNCT issues, teacher employment related, so if you want to go slightly off topic, that's no problem at all.
Just wondered if you could clarify what you were saying about the negotiations still to come and the fact that some things in the charter teacher decision might yet change. In particular,
Well, I don't think we're minded to revisit something we think the SNCT is disposed of. Sorry, excuse me. Where I think we are in terms of, well, I know where the EIS is, but other organisations will deal with it. From the discussions that have taken place within the SNCT on the other McCormick recommendations we haven't dealt with, there is a package put together. It's a package that will have some challenges for the unions, but by the same token, my view, and this is a personal view, and when it goes to committee, I don't actually get a vote. I would far rather get rid of all the McCormick recommendations in one sweep than have them floating in the ether for the next 4 or 5 years. The EIS Salaries Committee will have a look at that. It will go to our National Council, and at that point, I think we will then be in a position to contemplate when we take it to members and how we take it to members. We are committed to any package that comes from those recommendations to go to a ballot of our membership. I don't know what the other organisations are doing. My point about Convention of Scottish Local Authorities I make because they said it across the table. Before you take that package away, remember we've already agreed part of that package. Now, was that an implied threat? Yes, possibly. But I think from the EIS perspective, that's done business in terms of the SNCT. We've disposed of it. We're not going to revisit it. But those of you who've read the press carefully will see that the pay offer that they published before it was tabled, 1% across all workforces, and a commitment from all unions that they would engage in discussion in working groups with flexibilities. That's the reality of where we are in pay discussions for 2014 to 15. Now, we've managed to decouple those two things. We're no further forward in terms of where we will be with pay. But I have no doubt that the budget pressures that COSLA are facing brings them back to look for more cuts from service delivery and from teacher terms and conditions. That's a reality. How we respond to it, I think, is a matter in EIS terms for those people who come from local councils who are elected to take those hard decisions. I advise them, but I don't have a say at the end of the day. They decide the strategy, the direction of travel, and they'll decide what to recommend to members on McCormick, on pay, and other matters that are under consideration.
We'll make this the final question.
This is quite a local issue. Can you tell me about the funding that's been released to finish chartered teacher courses? I seem to be in a position where I have one module to finish, which I've paid my own fees for. I won't get the pay rise, and neither will I be offered to have my fees paid. I seem to have been kind of missed out.
Well, I've every sympathy with that, and I can't answer the question because pay of chartered teachers was a matter for the SNCT, that when people completed pieces of work, modules by and large, the report went from the provider to the GTC, and the GTC then would write to the employer, and the employer would make the payment. The SNCT are not in the loop that's described, the one that was described earlier by Bruce Robertson, that money will be made available. It will be made available by the Scottish Government. To whom it will be made available and the circumstances will apply has never been brought to the SNCT. It might be surfacing the work of the National Implementation Group, but it hasn't come to the union in any formal, structured way. So I'm sorry, I just simply can't help you in that. And if David Roy's still here, he should maybe chase after him. Did he get the clear? Did he give you a clear answer?